Okay, hello, welcome back all. This is going to be Unit 2, the start of Unit 2, so this will cover chapters 9 through 16. We already covered a lot of sort of the basics, right? Definitional terms, uh, the main theoretical paradigms, some of the major critiques of sort of econometric approaches, all this stuff, okay? So we should have sort of a good terminology built. And then the next section, part 3 of the book, is about sort of how do we model this stuff, right? Frameworks for analysis. So, chapter 9, Institutional Analysis and Development Framework, the IAD. We covered this a lot in chapter 7. This is by Ruth Schuyler House and Eduardo Orrol. And we'll go straight to section 9.2. And again, I just wanted to say sort of this goes back to the chapter 7 lecture and the chapter 7 reading about IAD and the framework of sort of Eleanor Ostrom and the Indiana Bloomington School. Okay. Section 9.3, we'll sort of talk about institutions for a minute. First, the definition of institutions that they use comes from a very, very famous book by Douglas North, that won the Nobel Prize in Economics that year. And it was about sort of how agricultural markets work in developing countries, and how the institutions affect sort of the outcome, right? Fascinating stuff, really, really excellent book. And Douglas North defines institutions as the rules of the game of society, or more formally, the humanly devised constraints that structure human interaction. And this would include the formal laws and regulations and rules, etc., but also the informal constraints, like sort of the social mores, the conventions of your society and your governance system, and the social norms around governance and compromise and democracy and all kinds of different sort of social norms, right? Okay, I would point out some of the difficulties before we move on. And we've covered some of these a little bit, but some are new. First, institutions are sort of ethereal, right? It's hard to pin down in reality, right? Like most people could think of like the IRS is an institution and it has a building and employment, whatever. Um, and that's sort of the normal way that people conceptualize institutions, but it's a lot more than that, right? And so some of it can be very difficult to pin down, when we're not talking about things like, say, the tax code or whatever. Um, the other is, one other is the sort of trying to parse out the formal versus the informal rules of the game, right? Because they bleed into each other. And especially the informal rules of the game are very hard to not only sort of see and recognize, but also to operationalize, right? Which brings us to our next critique, like how do we operationalize power or rules or institutions or constraints, right? Like, one of the possible papers in assignment 1 was discussions of veto points, right? And sort of a comparative perspective between the American federalist system versus sort of a more parliamentarist system, right? And so veto points in many ways can be considered these sort of institutions, right? But how do we operationalize that, right? Say we have a series of 6 in the American system. How do we give it like a number from 1 to 10 as to which one is most powerful? Or sometimes even like which uh, series do those 6 go in? Because that can change, right? And so these things are pretty difficult to pin down. The final sort of critique, well, not the final, the penultimate critique here is the nested nature of rules and norms, right? Which they lay out a sort of framework of 3 levels of norms or institutions, right? The operational level, the collective choice level, which is a little higher, and then the constitutional choice level, which is the supreme one, the highest, right? And so the operational is sort of the everyday activities of the agents in the game and their interactions, right? And then the collective choice level in the middle is the rules that constrain how the operational level works and how those rules are set at that level. And then the final highest level, the constitutional choice level, is about the rules that govern how rule setting works, right? And who can even be involved in these sort of collective choice decisions, right? So a little bit different from the levels that we learned earlier, micro, meso, macro. Okay, the final criticism I have here, and this is a growing criticism in this field, right, is more and more we are seeing, not only in the United States under the last few administrations, but also sort of across the world, especially as democracies slip into what we call competitive authoritarianism. But this idea that these norms don't mean shit if no one follows them, right? And so that's what we're seeing in a sense in not only the United States under the Trump administration, who sort of is ignoring some legislative and judicial rulings and these sorts of things, right? But also in places like Europe, where sort of the rising fascism and nationalism are creating space for this, I don't know, fuck the rules, like let's just implement massive changes idea, philosophy, right? Which is a bit troubling. And it's also not, at least in the United States, not in any way the intentions of our founders, right? And they're trying to sort of wrap this, around, oh, well, we still respect our founders' philosophies, but that's not true, right? But just know that growing, and there's growing literature in the research too about this. Like, okay, we can set rules all day long, and we can talk about policy processes and veto checks and blah blah blah. But if they just start getting ignored, then what are we even talking about, right? So this is a difficult sort of philosophical and governance approach that we're going to have to parse out moving forward. Okay, the next section, 9.4, the IAD framework. So basically, they break it down into three different pieces, right? You have action arenas, you have actors, and you have action situations, right? And they break all of this down in sort of 9.1, which I would suggest you go to. And it's got sort of the exogenous stuff, and then the action arena, and then interactions, and then it all sort of wraps up in evaluation, right? Um, but the action arena first is a set of nested. Oh shit! I spilled my coffee. Oops. A set of nested sub-assemblies of a broader interrelated social structure, right? So, like, obviously, like the entire federal government and all of the sort of micro governance at the state and the local levels, blah, blah, blah. We can't really, model for all of that, right? And some people do. Some people are looking for broader patterns of policymaking and that sort of stuff. But a lot of times, like we know that this policy making, agenda setting, whatever the steps are, there are sub assemblies, right? There are sub governance structures in each one with different NGOs, different politicians who are interested in this area, different, international organizations, blah, 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 right? Okay, and sort of this action arena is the space wherein individuals interact, etc. And you have 7 parts in this action arena, right? You have participants, their ideological positions, right? Their set of potential outcomes, because there are generally multiple, the amount of information which is available, the cost benefit analysis, sort of data and projections for each of those outcomes, the amount or degree of control over choices and strategies that will be implemented, and then finally the relationship between the actors and the outcomes, right? Okay. Part B, sort of the second subset in this IAD framework, is the actors themselves, right? So you have 4 variations, and their sort of power sort of depends on this, right? First, what are the resources that are under their control, right? More resources generally mean more power, right? Second, the values assigned to various actions and outcomes. So this touches on sort of the participant positions and ideology that we talked about earlier. There will be a multitude of outcomes, and people can place them in very different sort of series of best to worst, right? Depending on their own ideological or philosophical sort of perspective. Third, the way that they use information, right? So some actors or organizations are better at using information than others. The processes that they use for selecting strategies, right? So these are the four different ways that we break down the actor. And I wanted to say there's some nuance here that goes back to that sort of internationalist perspective and some of the sort of bounded rationality, of course, from Ostrom, in that they basically say, like, yes, we are using sort of this econometric approach, but we are assuming bounded rationality, not complete rationality or complete information, right? So you get informational asymmetries, you get misunderstandings of information, you get uh, siloing, which causes weird decision making, all of these sorts of things, right? So they take a more nuanced approach to the econometric model. All right. And then the third, you get action situation. So decision making, all of this sort of stuff, right? Okay. We'll move on to section 9.5, where they discuss sort of the external variables, right? So we have three main subgroups of external contextual variables, right? And they actually put four here, so maybe I just mistyped this. I'm sorry. Okay, the first is rules in use. Remember, this again harkens back to the stuff from Ostrom, which says that, like, yes, knowing the rules on paper is important, but we're far more focused on what are the rules in use. And this sort of harkens back to my critique earlier about this slippage away from following the rules across the democratic scene, right? And so basically, they say, how do nested and interlinked rules in use affect potential payoffs and losses? How do they demarcate the set of allowable or feasible strategies? And how do they influence actors' behavior, right? Okay, and so we have seven types of rules in use. We have boundary rules, position rules, authority rules, scope rules, aggregation rules, informational rules, and payoff rules. Okay, so the first, boundaries, is about basically who can participate and how do they enter and exit and how easy is that. The second, position rules, is about assigning positions of leadership, and it's basically about the hierarchy, right? Where is your position as an actor, right? The third, authority rules, basically defines what actions actors can even take, right? Um, and sometimes, like, actions are just completely off the table, right? The fourth, scope rules, like, what are we talking about here? What is the overall scope of the problem to be solved or resolved or discussed or whatever it might be, right? The fifth, aggregation rules. They define the degree of control that an actor has at a decision point, right? And so this is very akin to sort of the veto point stuff that we talked about, excuse me, in the first unit. Um, and kind of harkens to what I was talking about earlier about, like, how do we operationalize the power level at each veto point, right? Some veto points are stronger than others, right? Like, if the president decides not to sign a bill, that's a really powerful thing versus maybe one opposition member, trying to stand against a bill being signed in the Senate or the House or whatever, or a committee. How do we set that level of power? Okay, the sixth is informational rules, right? How is the availability of information affected for different actors? And then seven is the payoff rules, and this is basically like costs and benefits for each actor, right? As they move through steps or whatever, what is their utility payoff? Okay. The second subset of external contextual variables are attributes of the material context, right? What is the state of the world in this sub arena? What is the physical context, right? Like how much money might exist in the society? What does the infrastructure look like? Because these, even, right? If you don't have roads, there might be, it might affect like how you write policy or trade policy or um, these sorts of things, right? And then what is the type of good under study, right? So is it a public good? Is it a semi-private good? These sorts of things. Okay. The third subset are attributes of the community. So this is the culture, right? And this is difficult for an institutionalist, and I give Ostrom a lot of credit for this because uh, culture is hard to pin down, right? It's very difficult. There are arguments about what it even means, what it is, and then how do you operationalize, right? Like how do you put culture to a number that you can put into a model? It's hard, right? But the culture basically breaks down into another subseries of four. We have the norms in the community. We have the level of common understanding about action arenas, right? We have the extent of homogeneity in the preferences of those live in a community. And this is important because, you know, there's a lot of research out there that says like even racial homogeneity is incredibly important in like how public goods get doled out, right? And so if you look at countries like South Korea or Japan, where there's extraordinarily high sort of cultural and racial homogeneity, they are far more willing to dole out social goods like education and social safety nets and these sorts of things. And the more heterogeneous your society becomes racially or culturally or religious, whatever it might be, the more stingy public goods become, right? And we see this play out across the planet over time series, and also not only at the aggregate level, like internationally, but also sort of at the sub level, right? Like states in America or locales in America, right? So this is really fascinating stuff and very important. Okay. And then number four, the distribution of resources among those affected by the policy or whatever. And then finally, the fourth is about linking arenas and studying institutional changes. And they're basically just saying that we need to study the relationship between the different levels as well. We shouldn't maybe take that institutionalist perspective of the state as a singular powerful actor, right? Okay, that's all I've got for you. That was a lot in this one. So I really appreciate you being here. I will see you for the next one very soon. Have a great day.